So this presentation deals with a technical standard for benzene, which is being developed by the Ministry of the Environment. And this is a third set of consultation meetings with the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and which took place in February of 2016. The name of the team that's doing this work is Environmental Health Strategies, Inc. And my name is Jacob Shapiro. The company was established by me 25 years ago. I've trained at McGill and also at the University of Cambridge. And the clients of Environmental Health Strategies include federal and provincial governments, and we've done a lot of work with the petroleum refining industry over the past 10 years. The team also includes experts from US and Canada, with Patrick Foley, who's a chemical engineer with 25 years regulatory experience with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, pretty much all of it with petroleum refineries, and Jeremy Shute, who is a partner with Shared Value Solutions, with more than 20 years experience working with First Nations and conflict resolution issues. So the purpose of this work that we are undertaking is to review the standards for benzene emissions in various jurisdictions, primarily the United States Environmental Protection Agency and California, as well as in Germany, and compare them to what is being proposed in the technical standard for the province of Ontario. We're doing this work on behalf of Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and so we have been consulting with Aamjiwnaang First Nation for about 8 months now, and this work is still in progress. So our agenda for this presentation is to explain what is a technical standard, to explain how is a technical standard established, what is the process, in other words, that is ministry follows, and present the conclusions and recommendations at the end of the standard. In the actual meetings, we had extensive questions and answers periods, which obviously will not be part of this presentation. So what is benzene? Benzene is a clear and colorless liquid with a gasoline-like odor. Its most prominent source is use of petroleum, which is it's a natural component of crude oil, and it naturally occurs in other areas, including forests. The chemical evaporates, the liquid evaporates into air quite quickly. It is also a major component of some petrochemical products that are produced and used in the Chemical Valley in Sarnia, which include styrene, the use of styrene, and manufacture of styrene. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classified benzene as carcinogenic to humans, and therefore there is a requirement to manage it so that it is released in concentrations that do not present harm to residents who live in the area where these operations exist. So what is a technical standard? A technical standard is one of 3 regulatory instruments that Ontario government has to manage benzene emissions. The other 2 instruments are called point of impingement standard, which applies at the fence line of an industrial facility. And the third one is a site-specific air standard, which applies to a specific facility, not necessarily to the industrial sector that that facility is part of. So what is in the proposed technical standard? The technical standard is triggered when the industry finds that it cannot meet the requirements of a point of impingement standard, and it informs the ministry that it wishes to use an alternate way of complying with the Ontario regulations. The technical standard is intended to be based on the best available air pollution controls or technical methods. And in effect, what the plan is for the technical standard to have 5 components for 5 different processes in a refinery. And these processes are leak detection and repair for leaks that come from equipment such as valves, pumps, and flanges, from the wastewater treatment operations in the refinery, from storage tanks, from loading operations that include loading of trucks, tank trucks, and tank cars, rail cars, as well as loading of marine vessels. And the technical standard will also include requirements for monitoring for benzene concentrations around the fence line of the refinery. So the development of a technical standard is an opportunity. The technical standard will result in substantial reduction of emissions of benzene. However, the development of best methods to reduce emissions of benzene is open to some interpretation. Different experts may choose to interpret the regulations in other jurisdictions in a different manner, and potentially the industry experts will have a different interpretation of the regulations in the US from what would be another set of experts. And therefore, we are acting as expert advisors on behalf of the community to advise them on where they should target the development of the technical standard. So the technical standard setting process truly presents an opportunity for the community to influence what the final technical standard will be. So how is a technical standard established? Well, there's really 2 steps. First of all, you identify what are the important sources of emissions of benzene in a refinery, and we'll discuss this in a minute. And the other step is to identify what are the best practices to reduce benzene emissions from these sources. So the technical standard will, once it's finalized, will specify which practices the industry must use to comply with the technical standard. This will be mandated by the ministry to the industry. So we will look at what are the sources of VOC emissions from refineries. The information comes from our previous reports for the Ministry of the Environment and from public data that we use for that report. We'll look at the relative size of VOC emissions from the refineries. VOC stands for volatile organic compounds. And the reason we want to do that is because there isn't data on benzene emissions from refineries, but we also know that benzene is emitted together with other volatile organic compounds. So we can look at volatile organic compound emissions to inform us what are the relative levels of benzene emissions in a refinery. The table on the slide was extracted from a report that we produced for the Ministry of the Environment a few years ago, and it provides a relative size of importance of what these emissions are. So in the absence of better information, we can use this as a guide to what are the sources of benzene emissions, or the important sources in the refinery. So the biggest source, probably most important source, are fugitive emissions, which are leaks in a refinery from various components. They account for about 50% of the contribution of total emissions of benzene. Another third comes from storage tanks and handling operations, which includes loading. And stack point releases are relatively minor, less than 20%, less than 15% actually. And the other releases, wastewater treatment and collection of wastewater, account for a few percent of the total emissions. Our review that we've completed includes standards, monitoring techniques used in other countries, and compares it to what is being proposed in Ontario in this technical standard. So the jurisdictions that we have looked at have the strictest regulations in this area around the world, and they include U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the federal regulations in the United States. They include the federal regulations in Germany. And finally, they also include the regulations in the state of California, and specifically in the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which is known to have the strictest regulations in all of the United States and probably in the world. So the result of our review of the regulations in other countries is that the regulations in the United States and in Germany for managing VOC emissions, including benzene, are very detailed and very strict. In comparison, the current regulations in Ontario lag significantly behind the United States and German jurisdictions, and equally, they lag the strictest jurisdiction, which is the Bay Area Air Quality Management District in California. So this standard really presents an opportunity to establish stronger regulations in Ontario compared to what they are today, to reduce benzene emissions and to bring Ontario regulations closer in line with the U.S. regulations. What I will do now is to review in detail the actual conclusions and our recommendations from the regulatory review that we completed in the 5 areas that you can see on the slide. The first one is leak detection and repair, which deals with leakage of leaks of benzene, and I'll discuss that in more detail in a minute. From storage tanks, from loading operations, from wastewater treatment plants and wastewater treatment systems, collection system, and in fence line monitoring. So fence line monitoring is not an operation that emits any benzene, but it will be an important part of the technical standard, as I will discuss shortly. We will also look at an important area, which is what will be the applicability of each standard. It's an important part of a regulation. It will be an important part of the Ontario Technical Standard, and we'll discuss that as well. So the remaining slides will actually review what are conclusions and recommendations for each one of these areas. So the first area is the leak detection and repair and the applicability of that. I'd want to explain at first that the refinery is a very complex operation overall, with well over 100,000 components, sometimes as much as 200,000 components, which include pumps, valves, compressors, flanges, which are connectors that connect pipes. Each one of these has a potential to leak as a result of wear and tear and usage. And so the actual leak detection and repair involves a very comprehensive protocol of monitoring all the components, recording the results of the monitoring, protocol for repairs, so detection, so first monitoring to detect the leak, and then requirement to repair the leak within a certain period of time, and then the requirement then to monitor the component again to make sure that the leak was indeed repaired. It includes things like third-party auditing by third-party organizations. And so it's a very complex process which refineries are required to follow. Our recommendation is that this leak detection and repair apply to all areas of the refinery where the liquids, the process streams, have benzene in concentrations above 0.8%. We believe that this will include 95% of leaks of benzene in the refinery. In terms of the actual protocols, we recommend that the leak detection and repair standard adopt first the American standard that's currently used by more than 80% of the US refineries and is described best in the consent decrees that the United States have in place right now for over 80% of the US refineries. We also recommend that the standard include a phase-in, two phase-in periods. The first one, we suggest in 5 to 8 years, the adoption of the use of the leakless equipment, which is now used by a handful of refineries in the United States and is being used also in German refineries. And then another phase-in another 5 to 8 years to adopt the standards that are being used by the California's Bay Area Air Quality Management District around the city of San Francisco, which are the strictest standards in the United States. For storage vessels, we recommend that the standards apply to all storage tanks, that is new and existing, that contain gasoline, as well as all other tanks that contain products with benzene concentration of over 1%. So that would define the applicability of this particular component of the technical standard. The standard we recommend should include a choice of 3 ways of complying. The design of the storage tanks would either include an external floating roof, or an internal floating roof, or a fixed roof. The fixed roof would require to have a vent and a control device. Loading of product, we recommend be applied to loading of all gasoline and all other products with benzene concentration of over 1%. So the standard for product loading, we recommend an emission limit of 10 milligrams per liter, which is in line with the strictest standard in the United States. Our recommendation for wastewater treatment plant is that the standard be based on the current US standards, the new source performance standard. We recommend that there be no emission level to trigger this standard. It would apply to all wastewater treatment plants. It would include requirements for water seals on drains, covers on junction boxes, and we also recommend that it adopt the Bay Area Air Quality Management District requirements for covers and controls for both oil water separators and air diffusion flotation tanks. For fence line monitoring, we recommend that the Ontario adopt the new 2015 US EPA regulation for fence line monitoring, which will become effective in 2018. And the method that the regulation uses is based on using passive diffusion tubes, which makes it more economic than alternate methods. The US regulation requires the placement of a number of these tubes to be completely around the refinery fence line, regardless of the prevailing wind direction. In other words, they'll be surrounding the refinery with these monitors. There is no draft technical standard that we have seen to comment on at this point in time, but we believe that the adoption of the US EPA rule for fence line monitoring in Ontario would respond to some of the community's long-standing concerns about exposure to benzene and its effects on residents' health. So this concludes our presentation of the work that we've done in this area for the community. We are nearing the end of our review, and a report will be then submitted to the First Nations, which are public and consulting with the ministry on this subject, as well as to the ministry. And we expect that our report will be published on the website of the Environmental Bill of Rights, which you'll be able to find there at that time. Thank you.